All right, here we go, Crim 1. This is Crim 1, and we are covering now Chapter 13. Wanted to mention that we are going to skip Chapters 14 and 16. So 13 and 15 are the only two that we have left to do. So let's jump into it with community corrections. These are basically court-appointed programs where offenders are allowed to stay at home. So community corrections versus institutional corrections. Institutional corrections would be when a person is actually physically locked up somewhere. Community corrections is something like probation or parole, where a person is actually out in the community and they are rehabilitating in the community. Let's see, so there's a bunch of different things that are listed on this slide about community corrections. Okay. Probation is an alternative jail or prison in which the offender remains in the community under court supervision, typically under the supervision of a probation officer. And again, this is basically what my job was before I came here to City College. This is probation, the most frequent criminal sanction. So probation is more common than prison, jail, parole, any of those other forms of corrections. So keep that in mind because that might be something I might put on a quiz. Purpose of probation: allow the probationer the opportunity to be rehabilitated without incarceration. And the goals, of course, are protecting society and rehabilitating the offender. A lot of people would ask the question, why even bother allowing these people to be out in the community? Well, there are some benefits, specifically in a more low-risk offender. If an offender is able to stay at home, typically he or she might be able to continue working, which benefits all of us. And also consider family relationships. If an offender is unable to have a relationship with their children, sometimes that can be a negative for the children. Now, if the person is out of custody and, beating the wife up every single day at home, clearly that's not a person that you want to have on probation out in the community because their behavior is not suitable for the community. But there are reasons why it's a benefit to have someone out on probation. We also can't afford to lock up all the offenders. So if you consider that as well, another positive for probation. So it is viewed as a lenient practice. How effective is probation? I don't really know the answer to that. I think it depends on a lot of different things, but these are some of the goals of probation. I believe we talked about the John Augustus, who was the first guy who came up with probation. Probationer typically must report on a daily, not on a daily basis, on a regular basis. They must either go to school or be working, and the probation officer can go to his or her place of employment or home basically anytime, day or night. They cannot commit new crimes. They have to let the probation officer know if they move. They're not allowed to typically associate with criminals. The conditions of probation vary based on the needs of the offender. And what do I mean by that? Kind of a standard condition of probation for everybody on probation is obey all laws. But if you consider someone like a sex offender, for example, if a sex offender is on probation and living out in the community, is there anything you can think of that might be a good idea to limit that person from? Like maybe limit them from going on school grounds, going to parks, going to places where children frequent, things like that. So you're going to have two different types of terms of probation. You'll have standard terms, which is normal kind of for everybody, and then you might have some more specific terms. And that could be something like not go within 50 yards of a school, something like that. A lot of people on probation are open to search and seizure. A lot of them are subject to drug testing. This was kind of our thing. Every few months we would go through and do our unannounced visits at the homes. Anyways, there's a lot of different things that people could be required to do while on probation. Intensive supervision, this might be something where a person is actually wearing a GPS tracking device, or they're required to see their probation officer more frequently, like let's say once a week. Typically, working in the juvenile world, our offenders, we would see them once a month. But in the adult world, sometimes they have caseloads of up to 1,000 offenders. And as you can imagine, one person working 40 hours a week would probably not be able to see all of their offenders once a month. So anyways, there's all kinds of different programs. They could be on DUI, supervision. Intensive supervision just basically means they're being seen, they're in contact with their probation officer more frequently than others. We also have the exact opposite, inactive supervision. Inactive supervision would be when a person is never seen by their probation officer. And I used to have a banked caseload like this. That last bullet down here, you'll see banked caseload. I had over 1,000, and they were all banked, as they call it. So they just sat in a drawer, and the only time I ever pulled their files out was when they got arrested or their probation terminated. I know, seems ridiculous, right? So who is on probation? Here's a breakdown of race in the United States. Again, consider this as the United States, not California, not Fresno. What are the roles of the probation officer? Oh, there's so many. Anyways, making recommendations to the court, supervise offenders, make sure that the offenders are doing what's supposed to be happening. Yeah, blah, 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 assist offenders. I honestly felt like a second parent to a lot of my probationers. Sometimes I was their only parent, but anyways, we did a lot of stuff for them. How successful is it? Basically, the rate of recidivism is how we measure how effective probation is. So if an offender is on probation or has just completed probation and they reoffend, that is called recidivism. That is bad, and that would show that probation was not effective. I don't know if that makes sense. So I love this line here. Criticism, defining a success only as the absence of failure. Yeah, that's rough. And that was kind of like, we were not defining how successful our probationers were. It was much more like, did they get arrested again was kind of our big concern, which is a sad way to do that. There are two types of violations of probation. You have a new crime violation or a technical violation. So let me explain. A technical violation is a violation of the terms and conditions of probation that is not necessarily against the law. So what do I mean by that? Let's say I moved and I did not notify my probation officer within 48 hours that I moved. That could be a technical violation because the terms and conditions of probation say that I have to report within 48 hours my new address. A normal person who is not on probation does not have to report their address. It is not against the law. Does that make sense? So technical violation is a violation of the terms and conditions, but it's not necessarily against the law. New crime violation means I committed a new crime. The future of probation. Probation is changing drastically on a daily basis, especially in California, because the caseloads are getting so significantly huge. And again, why is that? AB 109, Prop 47, a lot of offenders are being released back out into the community. Evidence-based probation. This is another thing that was really rough for me as an old school probation officer. A lot of times I would base the number of visits that I had with a client on what I thought their needs were. And I felt like I was fairly effective at doing that. However, our department changed that whole concept and basically said that each case would go through a tool to measure the risk to reoffend. And if that person's risk to reoffend on that little survey was low, then we did not see that person as much. Anyways, that's evidence-based probation. It was rough for me. I'm sure that there is a lot of evidence and lots of studies that back its effectiveness, but it was rough. Parole. Parole is an early release from prison. A parole board decides when a person gets released on parole. Once they're out of custody, the whole concept of probation and parole are pretty similar. However, how they got there, very different. You get onto parole after you're released early from a prison sentence by a parole board. Probation, that's your sentence. You are ordered by a judge to be on probation. So, yeah. Very similar, very similar. A parole board group, these are the people who make the decision as to whether that person is going to get released or not. Parolees used to, yeah, in California, this is not necessarily true, but parolees tend to have more serious prior criminal record than probationers. So here's just a comparison, probation, parole. And you can pause it and take notes if you want. I'm not going to go over everything on here. Mandatory release or discretionary release. Some people are released from prison because they literally have timed out. That is called a mandatory release. Let's say I was convicted of carjacking and my maximum period of confinement is 10 years. I served every last day of 10 years and I got released. That's called a mandatory release. That means I was probably pretty bad. My behavior was probably pretty bad in prison. Discretionary release is when the parole board thinks that the person should be released based on their behavior. Blah, blah, blah. Who is paroled? Yeah, this is just kind of your standard data. Majority of individuals on parole are white. Blacks are not being granted parole as frequently as whites. Incarceration custody for black males is higher than for anyone else, and the average age of state parolees is rising as inmates are being sentenced to longer periods of time. I think every bullet point on this slide is important. Why? Right? I know. Good question. Why? Again, another little, oops, I think I skipped one there. Yeah. These are more roles of the parole officer, which is very similar to that of probation. Success of parole is determined basically the same way the success of probation is. I'm just going to look at that. I'm going to keep on moving. Most parole failures occur within the first 6 to 12 months of release. Imagine being released from prison if you've been in custody for something like 20 years. Can you imagine being able to function out in the community after that? Anyways, just some thoughts. Why are people so unsuccessful within the first 6 to 12 months? Because it's hard to get out of prison and try and succeed. Challenges of parole. Challenges of parole. More challenges of parole. Intermediate sanctions. This is that whole concept of diversion that we talked about before. Allowing offenders to remain in the community. Intermediate sanctions. Now this could be a drug court type program, veterans court, mental health court, you name it. And here's some other forms of intermediate sanctions, meaning these are not people that are being held in custody. Community service is one of those. You're probably all familiar with what community service is, whether you've had to do it to earn an award at school or for a club, or maybe you got arrested and you had to do some community service. So you realize it's for some sort of work that you do free for a nonprofit agency. Restorative justice. I think we've talked about this too, but this is the concept where the victim and the offender get together with a mediator and they try and work out the arrangements of the criminal behavior, the punishment, informally without court involvement. Restitution, of course, you could have to pay fines, or you could have to pay back someone for the damages you've caused. Forfeiture, this one's kind of interesting because some police agencies, if they are not able to determine that, if they're able to determine that something like a car was purchased through like drug money, then that law enforcement agency can keep that car. I know, right? Victim offender mediation's real similar to restorative justice, house arrest, electronic monitoring, shock programs. This is when people get locked up for short periods of time, like 10 days, 5 days, in order to shock them into better behavior. Personally, I think it's ineffective, but sex offender registers. We're all familiar with Megan's Law, probably. Go Google your, go check out your neighborhood and see how many sex offenders live in it. Sex offender tracking. All these things are true. Tracking sex offenders with GPS devices. I have a friend whose husband used to be a probation officer, and now he works for a private company that does GPS supervision of sex offenders. I want to say he has 10 high-risk sex offenders that he supervises. That's all he does. He works for a private company and he supervises 10 high-risk sex offenders in California. Interesting job. I would be willing to bet he makes a decent amount of money too. But day reporting centers, these are places where offenders will go from 8 to 5 Monday through Friday. Half the day they're receiving counseling services, the other half of the day educational or vocational services. Kind of skipping. Work study, work release programs. Other types of community corrections. Key terms, we're done. Okay, now I have to stop recording.